From Focal Point Radio and Radio Fairfax in Fairfax, Virginia, this is the Mimi Geerges Show. A lot has been happening in Egypt since the revolution to oust longtime President Hosni Mubarak. There have been ups and downs and ups and downs, but for the Coptic Christian minority, things have been pretty much down for a while. Samuel Tadros is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute and a Coptic Christian. He says that Egypt's struggle for modernity is inseparable from the plight of Copts. Samuel Tadros has written a book called Motherland Lost, the Egyptian and Coptic Quest for Modernity, and he joins me in the studio. Samuel, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Get us caught up on what's happening in Egypt now with respect to the Coptic Christians.
Well, the situation of Coptic Christians under the government of President Morsi was obviously deteriorating, both on the national level and on the local level. It is no surprise then that Copts were at the forefront of demonstrations that were asking for President Morsi's resignation. The Coptic Pope took a very visible role in support of the military's action to oust Mr. Morsi from power, joining both the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, other national figures, in this grand coalition against the Brotherhood. Of course, the visibility of the Copts in such an action against the Brotherhood has angered Islamists who are obviously already not that much in love with Copts, and has led to an increase in the level of incitement against Copts. We've seen an attack on the killing of a priest in the Sinai, a number of attacks in the Sinai on Christians and their churches, attacks in the south of Egypt, especially in the Minya and Luxor governorates. So we've seen an increase on the level of incitement, calling this a Coptic coup, that this is only led by Copts and that all the demonstrations are Copts. And hence we've seen those attacks happening against Christians, intimidation. The churches have been warning their members not to gather frequently in front of the churches. A lot of the services have been cancelled because of this. So it's an ugly picture at the moment, to say the least.
Did the demonstrations of June 30th surprise you?
It's no surprise that there is anger against the Islamists. Obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood has done the two worst things you can do to combine together. They've been both incompetent and insisting on excluding everyone else. So one can perhaps allow a government that's very competent to rule on its own. But if they can't manage to run a state in the first place, and they're insisting on doing it all by themselves, when that leaves people with nothing but to rebel against them and to complain at what they're mishandling of the country.
But were you surprised at the scale of those demonstrations? I mean, people were saying, 14 million? Some people were saying 20 million?
I don't buy those figures that much. I mean, we know the sizes of the different squares in Egypt. Tahrir Square takes 200,000 people physically. With all the places next to it, it takes about 480,000 people. So we actually know that it wasn't those 20 million and all, but it was definitely the largest demonstrations in the history of Egypt. I mean, this was certainly larger than the demonstrations against Hosni Mubarak. There's no debate there. However, it's also important to note that the demonstrations were geographically concentrated. It was largely in Cairo, Giza, Alexandria, the three major cities, plus the 5 governorates that the other presidential candidate, Ahmed Shafiq, has won in the Delta. So this is where the action was. There was very limited action. I mean, there was some demonstrations in the south of Egypt, but we're witnessing really a geographical divide there between the south of Egypt that was largely supportive of President Morsi and the major cities in the Delta that were rebelling against him.
Are you in the coup or not a coup camp?
I think it's hard to describe it as something besides a military coup. There's no denying that there was public anger. There is little doubt that if elections were held tomorrow, that President Morsi would not be elected again. So there is definitely public anger there. However, it's hard to deny that it was the military tanks that forced him out. Without the military tanks rolling in, there was no chance that he would be removed on his own.
Some people were calling it a popular impeachment, a people's revolution. What do you buy that?
No, I mean, the two things are not contradictory. We've seen a number of military coups in history that have had some level of popular support. the removal of the Mossadegh government in Iran surely had a level of CIA involvement. It surely had a level of the military moving against the Mossadegh government, but it also had a level of support in the bazaar in Iran. The same speaks about the change in Venezuela in 2002, the attempted coup against President Chavez at the time. The same goes for the change in Chile in the 70s, where Pinochet had some level of popular support in removing the Allende government.
You mentioned the CIA because I think the U.S. is in a very unique situation right now where the Brotherhood is mad at the United States for somehow supporting this military coup, if you can call it that. And the liberals or the people that were in the square are mad at the U.S. for supporting the Brotherhood. It can't be both ways.
Well, it seems that the United States is the perfect person, or the perfect entity to blame for both sides in the Egyptian conflict. It speaks volumes about the level of political discourse in a country where no one is taking responsibility for their own actions, and the U.S. is blamed by all sides. We've seen all kinds of crazy rumors, and the least of which is, of course, that President Obama is being currently impeached by Congress because of his actions in Egypt. It really takes people who are not following anything in the world to make such claims. The U.S. is in a very problematic situation. It has really disengaged from Egypt under the Morsi government. It has not criticized the Morsi government's extremely authoritarian decrees and actions, and this has put the United States, or painted the U.S. position as supportive of the Brotherhood. The U.S. ambassador in Egypt, Ann Patterson, was quite unfortunate in making this statement about street protests not leading to democracy. In the abstract, that's a very true principle. However, in a real situation where one part of the population is taking street action against their president, it's not the best of U.S. positions to take a position on such an internal manner. So the U.S. is damned if they do, damned if they don't. They're in this situation. They need to move very carefully in dealing with both sides at the moment.
Samuel Tadros is in the studio with me. He's a research fellow at the Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom. He's also written a book called Motherland Lost, the Egyptian and Coptic Quest for Modernity. Let's talk about the Copts. Give us a very brief overview and history of their existence in Egypt.
Well, the word Copts comes basically from the word Egypt. They are the natural historical inheritors or inhabitants of the land. They've lived there. Christianity came to Egypt quite early. Copts pride themselves in the history that both Jesus himself visited the land, escaping from persecution at the time in the Holy Land, and that Saint Mark, one of the gospel writers, is the person who brought Christianity to Egypt. It's a historical church. It's one of the oldest churches on which Christianity was built. The Copts have a very proud history of their contribution to Christianity, from the beginning of monasticism at the hands of Saint Anthony the Great in the deserts of Egypt, to Saint Athanasius taking the stand defending the Christian faith against the whole world at the time. So Copts have this very proud history of what they did for Christianity. It was separated from the rest of Christendom in 451 after differences over the nature of Christ's interpretations, different usage of words about how to describe this nature of Christ, and have hence been completely separated from the rest of Christendom. They belong to a family of churches called Oriental Orthodox. That's different from the Eastern Orthodox, the Russians, Greeks, and so on. The Oriental Orthodox are both the Syrian Christians, the Copts, the Ethiopian Church, and the Armenian Church. These churches share a common theological stand regarding the nature of Christ and all other theological questions. They've lived in Egypt since that time. They've come under the rule of Islam since 641. They've had their shares of problems under the rule of different caliphs and governors.
But before we talk about those problems, I want to know when they became a numerical minority in Egypt, because originally they were the majority.
Definitely.
Egypt was a Christian country.
Definitely. No census was held in the 8th century or the 11th to tell us exact figures. We know that conversion from Christianity to Islam happened gradually on different stages. We have a number of incidents where we notice that there was a clear shift, a couple of percentage points shifted. So a significant conversion took place. Such is the case, for example, under the Caliph al-Ma'mun, such is the case under the Caliph Marwan II of the Umayyad Caliphate, such is the case under Al-Hakim Ba'amrillah al-Fatimi, the Fatimid Caliph. So we have a number of clear incidents where there is a significant conversion taking place. Most historians would give the time frame between 832 and the 10... at the year 1000 yearly. So you're talking about this 150 years time frame.
And why were the Copts converting?
There was a variety of reasons. One of them is definitely persecution. We've had, again, persecution was not a monotonous process. There were rulers who increased it, rulers who didn't. There were regulations put forth on Copts, such as not wearing specific clothes, not riding horses, a number of regulations that we see up and down developing throughout the history of Copts under Islamic rule. So there are waves of conversion that lead to this, waves of persecution that lead to conversion. Another element was, of course, the incentive of joining the ruling religion and ruling families, especially at the highest levels of the Coptic intelligentsia at the time, the state servants. There was a lot of incentive for them to convert at the time. Another, of course, was simply assimilation. People lived in villages, part of them converted. Over time, populations lost their Coptic identity and it became easier for them to move into the Islamic direction. So you see a number of different processes happening at the same time.
Samuel Tadros is in the studio with me. He's a research fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. He's also written a book called Motherland Lost. When Egypt became an independent country and the British left, did things become better or worse for the Christians?
It definitely became worse. The independence of Egypt, if you're referring to the British leaving officially in 1954 after the 1952 military coup, Gamal Abdel Nasser and his fellow officers that participated in the conspiracy, none of them was a Christian. You saw an exclusion of Christians from the top levels of decision making.
Was that intentional?
It was the nature of the conspiracy in the military. Copts were not represented in the military in high numbers under the monarchy, and thus it was in a sense natural that if you had a purely army conspiracy, you wouldn't have a lot of Christians. At the same time, it's also true that many of those people that participated in the Free Officers movement had previous experiences with totalitarian movements, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1940s, the proto-fascist movement, Young Egypt, different communist movements, and in both Young Egypt and in the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, it was hard, to say the least, to find any Copts. So you had a generation coming to power that did not include any Copts within their midst. At the same time, you had the land reformation laws that took the land from the rich landowners and give it to the poor peasants. We noticed that many Copts lost their land among the landowners. Very few, if any, Copts received land. So that element was there. We also saw that the government under Gamal Abdel Nasser increased the role of Al-Azhar, attempting to build a form of legitimacy by increasing the level of Al-Azhar education. In 1952, Al-Azhar education as a university and as the Kutab system had less than 3,000 students in the whole process. Today, Al-Azhar has about 2 million students. That increase has happened in the last 60 years under the watch of those supposedly secular regimes.
And when did the Islamization of Egypt happen and why?
I think it's a long process. Egypt is obviously an Islamic country. There's no denying that the majority of the population are Muslims and that they have a commitment to that religion. However, the understanding of Islam itself has went through a shift and has been reflected in the public sphere. People usually point to the period after 1967, the great defeat at the hands of Israel, the collapse of the Nasserist dream led to this rise of the alternative dream, the Islamic one. We saw both the completely indigenous, in a sense, movement in Egyptian universities that they call the Islamic Sahwa in the early 70s. And at the same time, you had Sadat's policy of releasing Muslim Brotherhood members from prisons in order for them to be a counter to the left and the Naserites. As a result, you had both phenomena joining forces by the late 70s. You have people going to the Gulf and being affected by societies and cultures there. You had different processes happening at the same time that led to the Islamization of the country.
And that trend continues today.
Certainly it does. The public sphere has largely been Islamized, and this is continuing. The face of the country, the landscape of the country has changed a lot in the past 50 years.
You say in the book that there's a tension between those that see Islam in the public sphere as the problem and those that see it as the solution.
Yes, it's many of Egypt's early intellectuals, though described as the liberals that built this liberal age, 1923 to 52, really were affected by the French understanding of secularism compared to the American one, which the French understanding of secularism obviously views religion as a problem, as something, an obstacle in front of modernity, in front of modernization, in front of...
But this is just keep religion out of the public sphere.
Keep religion out of politics and out of the public sphere completely, which is, again, very different from the American understanding that views religion as a positive contribution to discussion, that views religious commitment and religiosity as something positive. So this understanding attempted to, the French one that affected Egypt, and most of Egypt's intellectuals at the time were completely enchanted with the French model, attempted to remove Islam completely from any form of discussion.
And did that backfire then?
Definitely. In a sense, it affected the reaction to Coptic demands. They never allowed the Copts to have any discussion on the Coptic demands. It's striking when you read actually Egyptian history how the same language adopted by Islamists today, denying that there is a Coptic problem, that that the Copts suffer from any persecution. This is the same language that the supposedly liberal politicians of the 1910s and 20s had at the time. In denying a Coptic problem, they denied the question of religion completely in the public sphere.
They just thought it would go away naturally on its own.
Yes,
we don't have to deal with it now.
They were, in a sense, social Darwinists who believed in the idea of human progress, that those things modern men wouldn't remain committed to those ancient ideas of religion. If we read the discussions of the 1923 constitution debates in Egypt, the debate about minority representation at the time, many Copts were asking have a quota in parliament in order to be represented. And the answer to them reflected this progressive view of the world. Religion wouldn't be a matter in the future. Can you imagine in 50 years anyone would be actually voting for someone based on his religion? Unfortunately, the world has not turned out to be like that.
Okay, so you say the Islamists are saying, there's no Coptic problem. They're fine. What is their goals for the Coptic Christians? Are they just trying to push them out? Do they want them all to convert? What do they want?
In a sense, they want them to return to a state of zimmitude, a second-class citizenship. We're not talking about annihilation at the moment at all, and unlikely to happen in the future. Although some pogroms and some attacks do take place and will continue in the future, but we're talking about a situation where Copts accept their second-class citizenship and act accordingly. Islamists are infuriated by the idea that Copts view themselves as equal somehow, that there is Coptic wealth, that the Copts are building their churches the same sizes of mosques. One very interesting example, telling example, was the Aswan church attack that then leads to the Maspero demonstrations and the massacre there. In the case of Aswan, the local Islamists objected to the church. They did not object to the idea that Christians exist in the village. That's acceptable. They did not object to the idea that Christians want to pray. Sure, that's fine. But they didn't want this place where they would pray to either have a cross on the building or a bell over it to be ringing, or the use of microphone or a dome, meaning that it should be a building without any description, a normal building where people go and leave and no one knows what they're doing. The idea, the public manifestation of Christianity is what angers Islamists the most.
Samuel Tadros is in the studio with me. He's the author of the book called Motherland Lost. He's also a research fellow at the Hudson Institute. Should the U.S. do something to help Coptic Christians? And do the Copts want that?
The U.S. is, of course, both a government and a people. Obviously, the individuals in the United States who have a concern about fellow Christians in some instances, or general concern for human rights, religious freedom, values that they hold dear, or obviously care about the situation in Egypt, are encouraged to take a role there. The U.S. government has committed itself to the spread of democracy, human freedom largely in the world, as something both beneficial on creating economic prosperity, creating peace among nations. A more democratic, free-loving world is a more stable world that is better for the U.S. and better for everyone. And as such, religious freedom for the minorities is an essential part of human freedom. There is no way that we can imagine a country that would have be at peace with its neighbor and at peace with its people and persecute its religious minorities.
But if the U.S. government were to say something about the Copts or try to pressure the Egyptian government in some way, doesn't that just feed the narrative that Copts are this, agents of the Americans and they're betraying their country?
Yes and no. In a sense, the narrative is there and continues to grow no matter what you do. So your actions are not exactly what leads to it. The narrative is already self-fed in this regard. The second, it's again important to note, the U.S. doesn't have to talk about the Copts. The U.S. can talk about religious freedom for everyone, for Egypt's Muslims as well as its Christians, as well as its few remaining Jews and Baha'is, for the idea that people can offer their own understanding of the relationship with God, that no religious institution should dominate and stifle or kill any ability of people to engage in religious-based discussions of interpretations of the world and dealing with it. So by standing for those principles, by standing for religious freedom, as well as standing for the other principles of human freedom, of democracy, of economic liberty, it's a whole package that the U.S. is trying to promote in Egypt.
So Samuel, was this July 3rd counter-revolution / military coup the end of Islamism in Egypt?
Hardly. We have to understand that Islamism is a real idea that emerged to answer a real crisis that the Muslim world has faced, and that this crisis continues. This is the crisis that Bernard Lewis has described as what went wrong. Napoleon came to Egypt in 1798, and people in Egypt were shocked to discover the complete difference between the Franks that they had left ages ago fighting and defeated in the Crusades, and those modern Frenchmen. They suddenly noticed that something different had happened in the world, that modernity, in a sense, had happened. And technological advancements, military techniques, everything was changed in those Frenchmen. And thus began the question, the crisis facing the Muslim world. Why have those people advanced and we haven't? How can we catch up? Islamism's answer is quite simple. We were once great before, and we need to return to the origins of our religion.
Go back to the 7th century Arabia.
To the pure form of Islam, and thus return to the glorious ideas again. So the basic tenets of Islamism are certainly continuing, and people
But
will
even
continue.
after this 1 year of disastrous rule by the Muslim Brotherhood, do people still believe that?
We have to realize that Egypt is a very large country with a very large and diverse population. One thing to note, however, is that the anger outside of the upper middle class in Cairo and the educated classes, the anger in the countryside was not directed towards Islamism as an ideology, it was directed towards the Brotherhood as an organization. The Salafis even joined forces in this grand coalition against the Brotherhood. So the anger is very specifically towards the Brotherhood as a movement that has been acting as a cult, as a movement that has been insisting on ruling alone, excluding everyone else, as a movement that has proved completely incompetent. Islamism as an ideology has not been discredited. The Brotherhood might be.
What about the liberals of Egypt? Are they our last best hope for pulling the country out of this?
The word liberal is problematic when we use in Egypt. In reality, there's an amalgam of a diversity and different groups there. There are Copts who might be have problems with the Islamic project for obvious reasons, but are not necessarily liberal. They share a variety of political views throughout the spectrum. There are Nasirites who have a competing alternative to Islamism, but they're not liberal in any form or shape. There are Trotskyites and other different leftist movements that are, again, their commitment to actual liberal ideology is non-existent, to say the least. You have a business community that sees the Islamic project as problematic for the economic prosperity of the country. So you're talking about a diversity of groups that share nothing in common but their fear or hatred of this Islamist project.
So really, there's no hope for democracy in Egypt?
Egypt, in a sense, is a country still in search of an identity. We haven't solved the question of who we are in the world. We like to say about Egypt that Egypt is the mother of the universe, Masr Dunya in Arabic. And it's a nice word to describe one's country. It's reflective of an ancient civilization that the world remains fascinated with, the pharaohs and all. But when one asks the question, there's a brilliant book by Leon Cass and Amy Cass called What We So Proudly Hail. And it takes, of course, the line from the anthem. And it's a question of what the values of the United States are. It's hard to ask this question today in Egypt. What is it that Egyptians so proudly hail? What is it that Egypt means today for its citizens? So unless its citizens reach a national consensus on what Egyptian actually means, on the role of religion, what role it can play in the public sphere without dominating it, unless we reach this national debate and consensus, democracy will remain a problematic issue in the future of the country.
So do you see that happening, that national debate?
Unfortunately, there's a very high level of polarization going on in society at the moment. There's a dehumanization of the other, whether it's the Brotherhood or from the other side, the non-Islamists. The Brotherhood view the people supporting the military's action as a minority, as mostly Christians, as against the freedom and democracy. The other side views the Brotherhood as an alien body to the Egyptian nation. There have been very alarming calls calling for the military to crush them, to kill them. You can't have a consensus when people want to kill each other and shoot at each other.
Samuel Tadros, he's a research fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. His book is Motherland Lost, The Egyptian and Coptic Quest for Modernity. It's published by Hoover Institution Press. Samuel, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Email me your comments or questions to feedback@mgshow.org and join us on Facebook and Twitter. You can support this program through a variety of ways. Just visit mgshow.org and click on the link that says Support.